So let's take a long deep breath through the nose. And then 4 short breaths. Long. And just keep your eyes closed. Feel your body. And apart from the sensations, perhaps like blockage or like a feeling of different emotions coming up in the body, just at this time, be aware of the warmth in your body. The warmth which is in fact your inner fire. This warmth which is connected to the light. This light, of course, which is the light of our soul. So we're just feeling and connecting to this on a physical level in the body as warmth. And now at the same time, just be aware of your emotions, the feelings of the morning, of the day, of the last 24 hours as well. Just whichever emotions have been coming up, heavy ones, light ones. And now just suffuse those emotions also with warmth. But this is the warmth of love, that glow of emotional connection, of emotional soothing, healing. And this emotional warmth, this warmth in the heart, really connects us to the love, that fire of love that burns within our hearts, that burns within the universe as well. So as you connect to this universal love, some of those heavier emotions within you might shift and change, carried up, transmuted in that higher love. And now become aware of your mind, your thoughts, doubts, worries, preoccupations. And as you just observe them, and as you just notice them, allow a higher frequency of thought, of mind to enter. Symbolically speaking, this is like an illuminated higher consciousness of thought. We can choose to stay in our lower thoughts, our fears, our doubts, our analysis, our judgment, and we can also decide to just surrender that, give over to the higher mind, which is our connection to the divine. And now integrate your body, your mind, your emotions by way of your spiritual connection. And this now can perhaps show itself as a light that shines. Of course, our theme today is the light of the inner flame which is the soul or the higher self. So just let that light surround you, and given that this is a higher frequency of light, it also is absorbed into your body. It's absorbed on your breath. It's absorbed through every pore of your being. This divine fire, light, warmth, love. And perhaps you notice a feeling of butterflies in your stomach, or energy of warmth that rushes through you, or anything else that just reminds you that you are going to a higher consciousness, that you're releasing some of the old uncomfortable ways, the uncomfortable comfort zones, and that you're consciously transforming your awareness, your experience, so that you can enter a state of true being, where you are committed to expressing your highest potential. So now just take a long, deep breath and sigh it out. And then when you're ready, just return by opening your eyes and being back. So, of course, our theme today, loosely speaking, is around Hestia, the goddess Hestia, who is the goddess of the hearth, of the kitchen fire. In the very old times, and there was always a hearth fire burning. That hearth fire kept us warm. That hearth fire was where we cooked. That was where we sat around with our family and community. And the hearth fire was also where the sort of sacrifices were made to the gods, or to the household gods, or whatever. So the fire is an essential part of our evolution as human beings. It's that step from first of all taming fire, and from there, sort of holding or having the fire in the home to make it possible for us to cook, to live in relative comfort. And of course, fire is not just about cooking a meal. Fire is also, on a spiritual level, about the alchemical fire, the fire of transmutation. Because after humans started to cook, we then reached the point where we could start to refine, smelt ores in order to make pure metals. And when we could make pure metals, that was kind of the next step in evolution. And of course, metal was such a huge leap forward. And that process of refining metal, again, isn't just about the products that we make out of the metal. It is about that very beautiful symbol of taking this impure substance, heating it up, smelting it, the dross, the impurities, the bits of earth or whatever that are in there, and become slag. Slag is like a black impure glass. So that slag is then sort of removed, and then the pure metal can be created. And that, of course, goes back to what I was just talking about, this purification process that we are going through in the world, but obviously in ourselves. And that purification process is made possible through fire. And of course, when we talk about fire in this context, it doesn't need to be a literal fire. The fire is also the light of consciousness, the light of the divine, which makes it possible for us to see ourselves, to illuminate the darkness that might exist within ourselves. And that darkness could be ignorance, that darkness could be bad habits, that darkness could be little, pockets of evil within ourselves, that as the light comes in, the light just very gracefully dissipates the darkness. You can't have darkness in the presence of light. So when we open ourselves to the light, we are making it possible to become illuminated, enlightened. We're making it possible to see better, see ourselves better, see our world in a clearer way, so that we can become like that metal. We can become purified, we can become stronger, we can perform new functions in the world, if you will, through that new way, that strengthened way, that we then can sort of experience and become. So it's one thing to kind of theorize about this and think about it, and through our visualization imagine that the light is coming in. It's a very different thing when we actually sit in the presence of fire, in the presence of warmth. And that fire can of course be the sun, but when we're in the presence of a candle or in the presence of open fire, we are directly interacting with that element. And that element is not only a symbol, but in the case of fire, it's very, very real. It's almost like information that's kind of burning there, and that's kind of holding a space. And as it holds that space, the information that it contains is conveyed to us on a physical level. And, of course, we can always, through our imagination, through our visualization, connect to an element. We have that power as kind of conscious beings, as magicians, to do that. But when we have it in the physical space, it's just that much more real, and it's that much more grounded. And we really give the body, the cells of the body, the gut, visceral experience, a direct interaction. And that just makes it all the more powerful. So in anything in spirituality, there is the visualized way, there is the sort of imagined way, which is very real, but taking it to the next level is to experience it physically. And that is, for example, why, the principle of pilgrimage is very powerful and important. We can imagine, going to a holy place, or we can imagine being in the presence of the divine. But when we actually do a walking pilgrimage, where we walk, where we experience different places, where we go into a process of anticipation of reaching this holy place, and therefore making it sacred in our thoughts and in our minds, but also walking it, also sweating it. And then when we actually get to that place, it's a real experience, and we are transformed just by the intention that we have set in embarking on that pilgrimage in the first place. The same goes for fire in this case. In the meditation, in the work we're going to be doing today, the very act of lighting that candle is already creating a ritual. It's already creating a threshold between normal life and between the sacred space that we're creating. And in our spiritual process today, we're going to do some breath work looking at a candle, and we are going to work with, through our intention, allowing that candle to represent the burning of the inner fire of ourselves, which is not only the inner fire of illumination, but it's also the inner fire of peace. Now, one of the other themes of the goddess Hestia is the principle of inner peace. And in mythology, Hestia doesn't really appear very much, because she was basically at home in front of the fire the whole time. But she was also very much the goddess of peace. She was very much in her space. She was in her space contemplating her external fire, the hearth, but she was also contemplating her own inner fire. So I think for all healing and for all, I think well-being, that obviously that place of creating peace is essential. And the creation of peace gives the body and the consciousness, the emotions, the space to stop being vigilant, to stop kind of being in a beta state of consciousness, which is a very erratic, sort of state of mental or brainwave activity. When we start to go into a deeper state of being, we go into alpha, which is reflected in our deeper breaths. And then when we go very much deeper, we start going into alpha and delta and theta consciousness. So that's when our breaths are very deep and we go into that very deep meditative space. And we've discussed this often, the different brain frequencies. Probably now we are probably in a more relaxed level of beta because we're kind of concentrating. When we start doing a little bit more conscious breath work, the process we did a moment ago takes us into alpha, but we are now sort of later on, we're going to try and get ourselves into delta and theta, which is a very deep state of consciousness, where we are no longer vigilant, where we are no longer worrying about what's happening out there. That's that sort of fluttery beta mind consciousness, where we get distracted, or where we in defensive mode all the time, where the ego is protecting us from the outside world. When we're in that defensive mode, all the energy of the ego and the body and the emotions are going towards survival. When we start to enter alpha mode, the slightly deeper level, we can still be aware of what's happening outside, but we are more integrated. And I really feel whenever we're in the presence of fire and we kind of create the intention to relax, or when we sit down to meditate, we automatically enter that space of alpha brainwave frequency, where we can become receptive, where because we're not putting all our energy into being vigilant and surviving, where we can allow the body, the subconscious mind, the inner healer to go through the body and scan the emotions, find the imbalances, correct the imbalances. So it's entering that space of deep peace. And symbolically speaking, when we are mentally active, when we are being vigilant and defensive, it's almost like there are the winds of thoughts that are sort of blowing in our head, blowing in our consciousness. And when that happens, of course, the inner flame cannot be still, it cannot be centered. And that's not to say that those inner thoughts will extinguish the inner flame, because probably that inner flame, relates to the soul and being alive. That is the light that makes us alive, as opposed to just being, bodies that walk around without any consciousness. That flame is our consciousness. But when those winds of thought are sort of creating turbulence, it's very difficult to kind of find our center. So when we create the space just to sit back and just to sit with ourselves, to contemplate ourselves, that is when that flame can burn bright. When that flame burns bright, we can kind of really see what's happening. A very literal image or explanation of that is when we are, let's say, sitting with a candle. Let's say you're in your room and you're with a candle and the door's open and the wind is blowing in. When those flames are kind of going backwards and forwards and flickering, you kind of can't see what's happening. Your eyes can't adapt to the darkened light. But when that flame can kind of burn constant, it's almost like there's less distraction, there's less movement, there's time to just then let the eyes adapt to what's happening in the room around you, for example, so that you can really see, so that you can then see yourself. So, the first step in peace, in finding this inner peace, finding this inner acceptance, is of course to to make the space, to intend the space, to create the time in your life for the contemplation, which could be meditation. It could also be something like going for a walk. Sort of getting drunk in front of the TV isn't exactly, even though it might be relaxing, it's not really a space for contemplation. So it's kind of a different thing. It's maybe a different level of relaxation, but it's kind of a distracted relaxation, and it's just a different intention. So when we do something with the intention of going deeper into ourselves, we expand the space, we make the space within ourselves sacred, and then that light can shine for itself without conditions, without expectations, without us trying to change anything. And that kind of implies that space of acceptance, acceptance of self, acceptance of where we are in our lives, acceptance of what our lives are at this time, in this moment. That doesn't mean that we have to be doomed to our current circumstances, but I really do believe that the act of kind of acceptance and surrender as to where we are is essential in the process of finding peace, inner peace, but also it's essential in kind of finding the quiet point of contemplation and knowing, so that we can say, okay, this is where I am, but I don't really want to be here. And that's very different to being in a state of discontentment with your life. Discontentment is one thing. It's kind of like you're at the mercy. You're fighting what's happening in your life. Certain things are happening, but you're not going with that flow. When we go into a space of contemplation and acceptance and surrender, we can look the demon in the eye, the demon being the thing that we don't want, or the thing that's not working for us. We can look that demon in the eye and just kind of make peace with it and be with it, and almost like learn from that adversary, from that situation that isn't feeling right for the soul. We can learn from that so that we can find the antidote. If we don't know what a sickness is, we can't find an antidote. We need to kind of diagnose it, and that is what this coming into peace and entering a space of contemplation is really about for us. It's to be able to see, to be able to diagnose, and then to be able to do something. But when we enter that space of peace and contemplation, it really shouldn't be all about, thinking about what we can change or thinking about how to change it. And there's kind of a little bit of a nuance here. It's almost like we need to find the place of acceptance first, of absolute acceptance of just where we are, of being able to say, this is where I am, I accept where I am. It's not necessarily where I want to be, but this is where I am now. And I'm just going to feel it out. I'm just going to surrender to these feelings. I'm just going to be with this. Accept it. Not try and alter in this time. And obviously, as we then start to sit with that inner space more often, that can become a process of transformation and change. But reaching the point of surrender where we can say, you know what, actually, I'm just here. This is me. This is where I am in my life. And I just surrender to the divine. And I think that's probably something that a lot of people have been coming up against in the last time of the pandemic, is there are a lot of things that we can't do, and we just kind of have to surrender. So it's very hard in some ways, but it's also very powerful to surrender, because when we surrender, we are basically surrendering to the divine, to a higher purpose. When we kind of, giving up and surrendering, one could say, are different energies. Giving up is almost like that sense of depression, desolation, giving up, kind of entering the death urge, where we just don't we just don't give a stuff. It's just like, whatever. I'm gonna rather get drunk than face all of this stuff. For example, I'm gonna get out of my head, and I've given up. I don't care. Which is that energy is very different to I surrender. But in my surrender, I understand that I'm surrendering to the will of the divine. I'm surrendering to the will of the light, and I think that's also a very important nuance. When we kind of give up to a death urge, we're kind of just not caring. When we surrender to the divine, we are surrendering the ego to a higher self, a higher aspect. We're cultivating or creating the space for our highest potential to grow and flourish. So a fitting image for that could be, in your garden. Let's say you're tending a garden, and the garden is the metaphor of life. When you give up, you let the weeds grow, you stop watering the garden, the plants die. The plants that have been growing for years and years and years die because they're not getting water, and you just basically don't care. The act of surrender is kind of, maybe a storm has gone through your garden and it's broken some of, the branches of some of the trees, and it's broken some of the plants. It doesn't look particularly pretty anymore because there are dead leaves and dead flowers everywhere. But the surrender is saying, okay, this is kind of the will of God, but this is an opportunity. I can prune my plants now so that next year they will make beautiful fruit and beautiful flowers, for example. And it's that continued cultivation. It's in spite of the loss, still cultivating, giving water, fertilizer to those plants, still tending, taking care, giving healing energy towards that garden, which is precious to you. The same goes, the fire, literally, because our theme is fire, it's the same thing. If we don't care, if we give up, we let the fire die. If we kind of surrender to the fire, we let the fire change, we let it become something else, but we still keep tending it. And that is what happens to us in our spiritual growth. We change, the fire changes, the pieces of wood break and they fall, and then we add new wood, and we kind of put care into keeping that fire going. So this energy of fire is really essential to our spiritual well-being, to our vitality, our youthfulness. We really do need to keep looking after it and keep tending it in order for us to live lives of quality. And the first step, of course, is always that sense of just showing up, putting in the energy, even when things are really tough or when we feel really despondent, showing up for meditation, just sitting for that 15 minutes or half an hour, doing it because you care about your spiritual growth, because you care about your inner well-being. And one of the most powerful things about ritual, of course, is that it is ritualized. It's kind of a habit. It's kind of an altered space that you're creating, which means that your body goes through the motions. It's something familiar. It reassures the body. Your soul, your spirit kind of also anticipates this. It has an intention in doing this, but it also understands that by doing the different physical things, you're creating a space, you're entering that space, you're sitting yourself down in that altered space so that you can just be open to something new. And again, going back to what I was saying before, it's when we enter that peace, when we enter that state of surrender, that miracles really happen. Because we're no longer holding on to the conditions and the judgments of how things should be. We're letting things be, we're letting things within ourselves emerge, and we're letting the divine speak to us, perhaps in words and language that we wouldn't normally understand because we're having expectations of wanting to hear certain things. But when we just quieten our mind and allow ourselves to just listen, we can hear those other words, those other languages, those other promptings, messages that come through, so that we can really hear, and therefore we can really be in step with where we need to be in our lives at that particular time. Again, let's not forget that I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands of years humans have tamed fire. I think it's something like 40,000 years. So the bottom line is basically let's even just say it's the last 10,000 years that we've been actively cultivating fire. It's kind of unnatural in the bigger evolution of humanity that we don't spend as much time in front of fire as we used to. That presence of fire is ingrained in our DNA as human beings. So it's kind of natural that when we sit with fire, we reconnect kind of to an ancestral practice, but never forget that whenever we sit in the presence of fire, we are also reconnecting to that very first spark of light at the beginning of the universe, at the beginning of creation, because it's through light that creation came into being. And lighting a fire is literally you lighting a prayer in a way to that light, making space for that light in your life. And just to go back to the symbolism of the goddess Hestia, whenever the ancients lit a fire, the first thing they would do is make a sacrifice to Hestia, honoring that preciousness of fire. And also whenever they founded a new city, the ancient Greeks would get fire from the eternal flame in the mother city, and from that they would cultivate that fire and light the fire of the new temple hearth in the new city. And of course, the Roman name for Hestia is Vesta, and the Vestal virgins in Rome were those 9 women, I think it was, virgins, specially chosen women who tended the eternal flame of Vesta. And that eternal flame was very much linked to the well-being, for example, of the city of Rome. So there is that fire, that presence of fire, which is important. And I think making fire more conscious in your life, especially in your meditation, is a really powerful practice to just kind of keep you connected, keep you focused and centered, and to remind yourself of that divine spark that you are. And the fire in itself has many lessons. It keeps us warm, it keeps us light, it dispels the darkness. And we're going to very specifically work with those energies now in our meditation.